All right, welcome back to the 3 p.m. session, everybody, here on the virtual Kentucky K12 Technical Summit. And we're excited to have you with us today. On track one, we're going to be talking about ERate and the funding that's available through ERate and all of the wonderful things that come along with that and the work that needs to be done there. And so we have a great panel discussion ahead of us today. We have the Mr. Jody Rose with us and also Rhonda Thompson and several others with us. Also, Clayton Potter monitoring the YouTube chat. If you have any questions or comments you want to throw in today, make sure you hit the YouTube live chat there on the screen. Also, if there's anything you want to comment or questions or parts of the discussion that you want to tweet out, make sure you use the hashtag KYText. And just like all the sessions today, we will have a post survey with an ELA certificate at the very end. And so you all can hit that link when we get to the end of the session today. So, Mr. Jody Rose, take it away.
Neil, I appreciate it. I'm going to try to get a screen share going. And while I do, I'll just admit that I noticed that this is the only session on either track where you had Q&A in the title. So I feel like that was a hint telling me to stop early. So to get on a topic like this, sometimes I just I take off and probably go too fast and talk too long. And so, but we need to know about ERate. So pretty important stuff.
It was probably more of an opportunity for me to ask questions and you to answer them.
Well, we'll see how that goes then. So let me try to get in presentation mode real quick and throw that slide deck up there that we worked on and see if I'm smart enough to stay in it for a few minutes. Are we okay?
Yes, we are good to go.
All right. So you titled this one "Don't Miss the Money," and then we started it with an overview, right? And you can't even touch ERate in 45 minutes or however long we've got allotted. But I'm just going to tell you. There's so many new people at this, and I've seen the program kind of change names and change focuses over the years a little bit, but I threw a couple of slides in here at the start just to really get super high level when we talk about ERate. I'm imagining that person that wants to be a CIO, or they just got that job dumped on them, and now they've figured out that they've got to know something about this thing called ERate. And so years ago, we used to call it USF, or universal service is a term you always hear stated. And so I kind of wanted to touch on that really quickly because you can't talk about ERate without the basis of universal service. So ERate's a federal program that seeks out to provide universal service. And so think of that like high-speed internet nowadays. It used to be phone bills and things like that too, but universal service in terms of high-speed internet across the country. We all know how important that is. That's been something that's been in the news quite a bit lately, right? Universal service is quoted because of the term Universal Service Fund, and that's actually a screenshot of one of my phone bills right there. So if you look at the bottom half of that, anywhere you've got a landline or a cell phone bill, if you see anything that says Universal Service Charge, and you do, trust me, if you've got a phone bill at all, that's where that's coming from, Universal Service Fund. So when you think about ERate and where is that money coming from, it's coming from something called the Universal Service Fund, and you'll oftentimes hear the acronym USF. And so the folks that have been at this for a while, remember we've talked about USF funds for, this program started 20 plus years ago. Another aspect of ERate, when you start thinking about that, is who sort of runs that program. And you need to know about the FCC, Federal Communications Commission. They are the ones that set the rules, right? So if you're mad because they don't allow me to connect students in their homes with ERate funds or certain facilities, or I don't know why I can't count preschool in Kentucky and things like that. Those rules are all established by the FCC. And so every so often you're seeing people create legislation and lobby some things to try to get that changed. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a second. So the FCC is at the heart of all things ERate because they are setting the rules. And then this other acronym, you'll notice there's so many acronyms in ERate technology in general, right? Usac, or the Universal Service Administrative Company. They are a company that was created essentially a nonprofit that's just tasked by the FCC to administer this whole ERate program. And so when we file all these forms that we may get into, you are filing those with Usac. If there's a review going on, they're asking questions. That's not the FCC asking questions. That's Usac asking questions. They are the company that's been contracted by the FCC to handle the administration of the program, the distribution of the money, and unfortunately, sometimes taking back money, denying applications, and the tougher parts of it. So if you combine USF and the FCC and Usac, you kind of lump all that together and you've got the ERate program. There's 4 major areas. Obviously, we're concerned about the schools and libraries division, but just so you know, ERate, there's also a program that deals with rural healthcare. There's a high cost program, which might impact some of us. There's underserved areas. The FCC has a certain way they define underserved areas and areas that are very expensive to get access to. Sometimes you think about things like tribal lands, villages in Alaska that may be just miles and miles between other small community groups. And so we definitely would think of those as high cost areas. And then there's also a Lifeline program that some of you may know something about that's meant to help with the cost in high poverty subscribers, getting them internet access, phone access, and things like that. So there's 4 aspects really of Usac in general and their management, but the schools and libraries division, which is really what we talk about as ERate, that's kind of the main focus of this. I laugh when I think about this because literally last week when we were talking with Neil about this session, he said, we need to make these things relevant, need to be related to NTI and things going on today. And so actually, literally, I was reading this link today. There is proposed legislation out there called the Remote Learning During COVID-19 Act. This is not passed. This is just proposed. I've got a link to it. We can pull it up here in just a second if you'd like. But there are a few groups that have helped develop this. One of them, the Schools Health Library Broadband Coalition. I'm less familiar with them, but the SECA group, the State E-Rate Coordinators Alliance, is a pretty powerful group. And then Funds for Learning is a well-known consultant in the E-Rate world. And so they've kind of banded together and said that this is what we need. We need this influx of money to help with remote learning. And so I put a few high points there. First of all, keep stressing, like, this is just proposed, but you know how this stuff goes. If it gets passed, we need to know what what this really is going to mean for us. And it could be pretty substantial if something like this were to pass, because you're talking about a one-time allocation of over $5 billion. That's with a B. And they're talking about allocating that money to the FCC, which, based on what we just talked about, should mean to you, I bet they somehow make all this stuff work as part of like ERate filings, and USAC would be involved. And so if something like this passes, we may all be learning really quickly about some different aspect of ERate, right? So that's why I wanted to make sure we included a little bit about that here today, even though, again, it's all proposed. There's nothing that says this is going to happen there, but there's, as with a lot of other organizations, they're lobbying about trying to do some things to help in the midst of the pandemic, right? And so if it passes, it supposedly would deal with broadband service in the home, end user device, a lot of things that we hear discussed even in K12 world, right? Like we get devices to the students, getting access to the homes and the families and things like that. It even specifically mentions allowing schools to extend their existing networks in the community, which is something that some have asked about. We've kind of danced around that a little bit over the years. It's really kind of a no-no right now with the ERate program that everything's based on your entity, your location, where the school or the library resides. And so if this passes, there may be some gray area and some changes there. And then the last one I took literally from this website that I've got linked there above about trying to streamline the review process and the approval process so that schools and libraries receive their funding and prepare, so they'd be prepared possibly to do more online instruction and learning in the fall. So you can see that if this were to get through, it's really going to be fast tracked. So it's probably worthwhile that we know a little something about that. Not that it will happen, but it's certainly relevant to the discussion today, which is why I added that in there. Right. Neil, I know you kind of put some things in here about a timeline. We can talk a little bit about that if you want. There's some other things I added after that.
Yeah. One of the things I put in here, that the timelines are really key. And I know that in the registration for today's event, we had a few new CIOs that had marked that they were new to the job, either starting in June or starting in July. And so one of the things that I will always share with any new CIO or new person that's taking over the E-Rate coordinating is really keeping on top of the timelines. But also important to that, and I'm gonna make my video big for just a second. If you look behind me here on this red shelf with these red notebooks, those are all E-Rate years. Each one of those red notebooks, and I tell Courtney, our field staff, I tell her that's my if I get hit by a bus shelf. You come in and you take all the red notebooks. Obviously, I also have digital uh, archives of all the records as well. Got folders on top of folders for all those things. But those that shelf of red notebooks is all of the different forms and the documents, the inventories, the PIA reviews, all the questions, all of those documents um, are there on that shelf. And you all may not have seen it in the Google Meet, maybe quite as big, but I showed that on the YouTube channel, the red shelf there. So keeping those records is really hand in hand with the timeline, because if for no other reason, it's one of the few programs that you have to keep records for 10 years. And so that's something that's a little different about ERate than maybe some of the other programs you might be used to doing. But everything that goes into that ERate program, you got to hang on to that stuff for 10 years. And so all of those red notebooks back there have a sticker on them that say the year they were made, and then the year after which that they could be discarded. So that way, in case I'm not here, someone can see that and they have those records. But on the timelines. This is one of the things I got my start with the notebooks and learning about ERate actually back in 2002, 2003, back when there was a backlog of ERate years and we all got funded for like 3 years at once, and we were spending like $2 or $3 million at a time back in those years, and I started learning from the technology coordinator that I served under then. Kind of how all this works. So just some of the forms and numbers that you're going to hear. Um, so in July, so coming up, if you're new to this, and your district has received a funding commitment decision letter, an FCDL, you'll hear about. So if they've received an FCDL, or shortly after July 1, we file that Form 486, and what that basically tells Usac is that this service has started. So if it's a service that hasn't started yet, then you don't want to file that until it actually starts, or at least you put the date you expect that to start. And that lets Usac know that they may be receiving invoices from the service provider. If you're doing what they call an SPI, again, another acronym, if you're doing the service provider invoice where they're invoicing Usac directly and they're only sending you a discounted bill. We'll talk about the differences there in a minute, but that 486, that's the next thing that's coming up really soon that you'll be looking at on your timeline, and that says, hey, these services have started. We're ready to start paying these bills, and so you got to make sure you get that done in the July timeframe or shortly after an FCDL is issued if it's not then. The other thing too, a couple of years ago when ERate switched, now they do direct deposits of reimbursements. So if you don't do the SPI, and let's say, for instance, you get your fiber lease bill every year, and you pay the full 100% of that fiber lease bill, and then you do what we'll talk about later being a bear form, then Usac will send a direct deposit of that amount back to you. And they'll do that directly. It used to be checks years ago that went through the service provider, and there's lots of different things that went on there. But the Form 498, you'll need to work with your finance department when the fiscal year starts, because one of the things that I ran into for a couple of years, we actually changed banks at our school district every year. For about 3 or 4 years, we were changing banks every fiscal year. And so it's definitely something when you get into filing that reimbursement, you want to make sure that you've got the correct financial institution, because then when the direct deposit tries to go through, if it goes to the wrong bank, you may not actually get that reimbursement from USAC. And so you want to make sure that you work with your finance department. And I actually give the finance department access in EPC for them to go in, and they put the financial institution information in that 498. And it's a fairly simple process. The other big thing is then in that August to September-ish time frame, you usually we'll start thinking about, okay, what am I going to need to file for this year? So always review the eligible services list when it comes out. USAC produces a services list of things that you can apply for and what things that can be used for. So you'll want to start reviewing that. The other thing, especially if you're taking over new, is reviewing all of your contracts. What active contracts do you have? And knowing when those are going to expire or when they're or knowing, is it a fiber contract that's annual with yearly renewals, and how many renewals do you have left on that contract? Because that's going to determine whether or not you need to do a 470 for something. So a 470 is essentially an E-rate request for proposals or bids that goes out there. It goes to all the E-rate providers, and it's what you're asking for. What am I asking for bids for? And you have to have that out there for 28 days. And so you need to know those things going in when that 470 window opens of, what things is that I'm going to ask for this coming year. And then the other thing in the August, September timeframe, you definitely don't want to wait until October because you get close to the deadline. But those 472 bear forms, so that is the build entity something reimbursement.
Applicant reimbursement. Yeah, build entity
Yes.
applicant reimbursement.
I always miss the A. So on that one, again, like for instance, my fiber lease for our district fiber lease connection, we pay the full amount of that bill all year long. And then, in August, I get all those bills, and then I go through and I apply for the bear reimbursement for, in our case, a 70% discount rate. I apply for that and get that back via a direct deposit. So if your service provider is not doing an SPI where they're actually billing USAC and they're only sending you a discounted bill, you need to make sure that you have that done. So on the next slide, I think we look at when we actually get into E-rate filing season. So this is, what are we going to ask for next year? Granted, these are services that are going to start after July 1 of the next year, but you got to start thinking really super early. What are the things that you're going to ask for? So again, that 470 window where you're seeking bids, that usually opens up in the November, December timeframe. You can file those into January, but you really got to start watching your timelines and making sure that you can put that out there. You can ask for whatever it is that you're asking for and allow for a 28-day window that's prior to a board meeting where you're going to have your contracts approved. And then you still have time to make the 471 filing window. So the 471 is actually the application. That is usually opens up in January timeframe. It ends in March, typically. Again, those are always announced. That those timelines are announced every year on the USAC website. But the KE team and Scott Kane and all those at KDE do a great job of keeping us informed on the timelines and what's coming up with E-rate. But the 471 is the actual application where you're going to say, for this school or this building, I'm requesting, is it fiber access, or I'm requesting switches on category 2 or Wi-Fi access points on category 2. And so the categories are something we probably need to talk about in a little bit, and I know we've got some of that discussion coming up. But after you file the 471, then the big thing there is stay alert, because as soon as you file that 471, you may start getting PIA review questions. So they're questions from the reviewers like Jody was talking about that work for USAC. They look at your applications. I got PIA reviews really fast this year. And in fact, my 3 471s that I put out there, so I filed 3 separate applications, they've all been committed already, which is really fast. I never have had all of mine done by now. And so I got the PIAs and all the commitments in. I think I got the last one last week. So that was really quick this year, which I was surprised with the COVID stuff. So maybe they're more efficient working from home. I'm not sure, but make sure you stay on top of those PIA questions. You usually have 15 days to answer their questions, or it can cancel your application and you'll lose out on that money. All right, so go
Right.
ahead.
It's fine. It can be overwhelming, right? And I know
Very.
what Neil was working on there was trying to lay out a calendar year timeline. And he did that July to June, which makes sense because every funding year is a July to June time frame, right? And so, but the part that can really get confusing is as a tech leader that's filing E-rate, you can be working on multiple years at one time. And so I could be sitting here in August or September and trying to clean up any reimbursements from the previous year, be in the midst of getting applications maybe still approved for the current year and already thinking about what I'm going to file for the following year. So there are times that you could have up to 3 different E-rate funding years that you're kind of working on at the same time. And so
Exactly.
we've done some things like flowcharts and such in the past, and I'm the first one to tell you if I think their website's kind of bad, but I do love this part of the Usac website, so I'll feature it here. If you're just looking for another good place to start, I've got it linked there in the slide deck. But if I go to that usac.org/erate with the hyphen there, the way their site works is you'll get that part of the page and you just hover your mouse pointer over E-rate, and a separate large submenu appears, and everything down the left-hand side there on the getting started part of the applicant process. So, before you begin, it starts getting into things like, making sure you've got legal school entities that you can file for, and sort of understanding the process, competitive bidding. That's what Neil was talking about with the Form 470. Selecting service providers, that's where you've actually filed a 471, or I'm about to file a 471. I've selected the people I want to do business with, and I want to file that very important Form 471. That's covered in the selecting service providers. Well, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Competitive bidding is 470. You wait your 28 days for bids to come in, you make your evaluation, and there's a lot of detail in that section on selecting service providers. Applying for discounts, I've made my selection, then I'm actually filing the Form 471. Application review, you mentioned earlier the PI review and the program integrity assurance things that they go through. Starting services, that's where we confirm with USAC that we're starting services, and we would file a Form 486, ideally in the July timeframe, give or take. And then the invoicing, we touched on that a little earlier with the differences in whether you're paying the full amount and seeking reimbursement via the BEAR process, or whether you're only asking the service provider to bill you the discounted portion and telling them, hey, you go get the lion's share of the money from the E-rate program directly. And that's the SPI, or service provider invoice section. So how you invoice, right? And then, of course, there's this final thing before you're done. Before you know it, you're starting back over again at the application process for the next year. So I could walk you through that, but I mean, there's no sense me going to the website. I've kind of laid it out for you pretty quickly right there. Just usac.org/erate. There's a ton of stuff on that site, but somebody new at this, I would probably sit down and read through that. Of course, each of those pages has got several links within. I don't want to pretend like it's a super easy process to get up to speed, but it's a pretty good place to start, right? So,
And I will say
any
too,
any questions at this point? I mean, I'm going to dive into some of this stuff about what you can be filing for. We might even talk about Cat 2 funding for the next funding year and things like that. Go ahead, Neil.
I was just going to say that, even for me, for somebody who helped out in the early years of, the 2003, 2004 filing years, and all the paperwork and the colored paper that you used to get in the mail, and, each of the colored forms that came in and all those things, that wasn't so bad. But even now, I really honestly think that USAC has done a pretty good job with the EPC of making it a fairly easy process. There is a lot of moving parts, like you said, and especially if you're working in 3 years at once, which typically we are. But I would argue that it is a better process now with EPC, which is the portal now that you actually file all these applications with. For the most part, it works pretty well, I would say, and so it's not as scary as it used to be, I don't think.
Yeah, well, yeah. So EPC, the E-rate Productivity Center, the portal, as we all call it. Yeah, I'll say it is easier in the sense that everything's in one place. I think the portal itself is still kind of a pain to navigate. They have actually they've talked for a couple of years about, I think they've got some money budgeted to do it, where they're trying to get developers to rewrite that portal and make it more user friendly, because there are some sections in there that are kind of a headache to navigate around in. But and of course, once they do that, we'll have to relearn how everything is in the portal once again. But yeah, it is nice that most everything you get to do can be done in that interface, and so that part is good. Are we good on questions? I know it's an afternoon session, and a lot of stuff may come up after the fact. So
I don't
I'm assuming we're okay.
I don't think we have any questions in the chat. We've got a little shy of 50 people in the session right now.
Right.
So thank you all for joining us today. So let's,
yeah,
you can keep
hanging in there on a sunny summer afternoon. Sure. Let's talk about ERate, right? So Neil titled this slide, what should we be filing for? I get this question quite a bit. And so to me, if you're somebody new at this, you got to know what you can file for. And so that gets back to that eligible services list that was discussed earlier very briefly. I put a link there in the slide deck that you can reference later. And so you notice it's in that before you begin section. I talked about those sections that they have in the applicant overview process. And so there is something called the eligible services list that gets published annually, and it details, again, by the FCC and Usac, so the powers that be. The FCC is kind of putting out this eligible services list. They're the ones that make all the rules, like we talked about earlier. So what can we file for? What should we be filing for? If you want to know what you can file for, you got to be able to at least navigate that eligible services list. At a very high level, there are two primary categories of service. Category one, which essentially deals with connections between your schools, between your entities. KE leverages Category 1 ERate services very heavily, because that internet connection that goes into every school district through the AT&T MPLS network, that is a Category 1 ERate service, and we file for ERate discounts on district's behalf. Of course, as many of you know, we get that large reimbursement and we hand it back out to school districts in form of offers of assistance. And so it is in everybody's best interest that the ERate program keep functioning very well in that regard, because it directly impacts the size of the KETS offer of assistance for school districts. So Category 1 districts have that as well. If you are a single campus school district, a small district where all your schools and buildings reside on one campus, you may not have monthly charges, but that fiber connectivity between the buildings would be a Category 1 service. That's something they clarified a few years ago. And so there are ways that you can take advantage of ERate opportunities to possibly replace those connections if the fiber's getting old, needs to be updated, or if there's, you've got strands that are getting broken and things like that. And for you larger districts where you've got outlying schools and entities and facilities, obviously, usually you get in a situation where you've got monthly leasing cost to lease connectivity between those circuits. And so those charges, which again, I should have mentioned this earlier, everything you file for, you've got to have a contract in place to reference and make sure that everything's being fairly and competitively bid. And so those monthly leasing arrangements that you might have a 3 to 5 year contract with some renewals and things like that in there. But that original contract has to be bid fairly and openly, but it would be funded as a Category 1 service. What many of us have talked a lot more about, because the money can really help us on the network side of things, are Category 2 services. And so Category 2, the way I try to explain it to people, ERate, up to this point, has never purchased end devices. Even when you could buy phone systems, the ERate money, but you could never buy handsets. So even though we've had internet connectivity for 20 plus years with ERate funding, you could never buy computers or devices with ERate funds. But everything from that faceplate back on the wired side of things, or from that access point back on the wireless side of things, has some ERate eligibility. Most of it is Category 2 until you get to the actual internet connection itself. And so anything between wiring closets inside a school, anything within a wiring closet, the routers, the switches, the cabling itself, the racks, the UPSs, as long as they are supporting eligible equipment. And then out there in the classrooms, the access points themselves, cabling work itself, a lot of things like that. In addition to, they've kind of broadened that a little bit. Everything I just named is what you call internal connections. And so there's also this thing called basic maintenance of internal connections, where depending on the arrangement that I might have with a provider to keep those things up and going, maybe I'm paying somebody to update the firmware on my switches annually and to make sure my configurations are solid, or whatever the case may be. Maybe I just want to outsource this whole thing and pay somebody to, I'll just pay you annually to kind of keep a network for me up and going. That would be a managed internal broadband service. We see less of that around the state. I don't want to say we see none of it. We see less of that around the state, but that is something that they deemed eligible in recent years. You got comments on that one, Neil?
Well, I was
Now
just
I
going
should
to.
ask Rhonda. I know you had Ron on this list too, and I haven't had a chance for her to chime in yet either. So
Sorry, Rhonda. We're dominating the conversation over here. You know, jump in
You all
anytime you
are
want to.
way more experts than I am.
I was going to say on the managed internal broadband and basic maintenance. Actually, that is what I did the majority of my filing on this year, and it was actually fairly easier than I was concerned with. And like I said, those have already been funded for this coming year. Even with the PIA questions, they weren't that bad. But if you've got good records, it's easy to answer those questions. So that's part of keeping those records through everything. It's easy to answer PIA questions when you've got everything right in front of you, and that helped a lot this year, especially with all the other craziness that was going on, plus getting PIAs. But the if you have come to a situation, I know we're going to talk about the budget here in a little bit. So Category 2 actually has a set budget for how much you can ask for. And so we had some room in the budget. And in our instance this year, we had already replaced all the access points. In the last few years, we had replaced every switch in the last few years. We had new UPSs supporting those switches everywhere. We actually ran new fiber between our closets in our buildings, so we're pushing 10 gig between closets. Plus, we've got 10 gig fiber running to our core. So, and we had new core. So, for us, we had really done all the hardware there was to do. We'd done all the wiring there was to do. And really, it came to the point of, well, now we're also talking about the people side of IT. Maybe we can utilize this to take some of that pressure off of our department as far as managing that equipment or managing the the wireless internet or managing the wired internet, or just making sure things are updated and maintained. And so that's where we focused our filing this year, was on those two things, as well as our normal fiber lease.
well, and I mean, you hit a couple of key points there. It certainly can be done, but I would say you need to know your budget, and you better be crystal clear on what is and is not eligible. Nothing will get you denied faster than either asking for more money than you're entitled to ask for, or asking for equipment that's blatantly ineligible, or equipment and services, I should say, that are blatantly ineligible. I know they do go into some detail in the eligible services list trying to describe what you can and cannot do when it comes to managed internet, broadband, or basic maintenance of internal connections, right? So,
and in fact, for stuff like that, I literally copy and paste out of the eligible services list when I do an RFP, when I put it in the narrative on the 471, when all of that stuff is a literal copy and paste. This is what I'm asking for. I know this is what I'm going to spend it on. And so it's a copy straight out of their eligible services list when you do stuff like that. And making sure your vendors that you're working with, making sure that their stuff has that language as well.
good point. I mean, I know I've leveraged other people's applications, just searching around on the web trying to find the right way to phrase something to help a district know what it is they're asking for. And so, man, the main thing is you make sure you're filing for eligible things, and you make sure that you're staying within budget on anything that you do file for. So you'd ask about wanting to know what our budget is, I think, Neil, when we were kind of putting these slides together. And I worked with Scott and Caprice. We did a session at Kisti in March, a couple of days before our world kind of changed, and we talked a lot about the future 5-year funding cycle with ERate. And so there are a lot of changes afoot. Most are really positive for our school districts. It's a lot more than we can get into even in a full 45-minute session, much less the few minutes that we have remaining. But we start talking about budget. Keep in mind, we're talking about Category 2 budget. There is no current cap on Category 1 services. So, if I'm filing for Category 1, as long as I've shown that that's the most cost-effective solution for my district, there's nothing that says, oh, well, that was too expensive, you can't file for that, right? So now you may get some questions if you're way out of line on how expensive the service is. And they do surveys of applicants and things all the time to try to figure out, if it's costing Neil $10 a foot to run fiber in Pikeville, and it's costing Rhonda $20,000 a foot to run it in Jackson County. Well, okay, it might be a little more there, but it's probably not that much more. Something doesn't make sense to me, right? So so they may ask some questions like that. But typically when you hear budget, you think category 2 budget. And so think back now to what we talked about earlier with your internal connections. If you were buying switches and access points and cabling projects and UPSs and racks and all that fun stuff, right? Years ago, and we could walk through all the rules changes over the years, but they have made efforts over the program's life to improve this particular piece of it so that everybody got a fair shake at things. In some of the early years, I may actually show you a couple of graphs later on, but we had certain school districts that, because they had higher poverty, they would get funded all the time for these services. And other districts that had poverty, but not as much poverty, would miss out year after year after year. And it led to this huge inequity. And so there have been a few different rules changes to try to fix that problem. What they came up with roughly 5 or 6 years ago was a 5-year budget cycle where they said, okay, we're going to allot $150 a student for every school district in the country over a 5-year period. And then they allowed for some slight inflationary increases. So roughly $30 per student per year. And so then this most recent funding year, I think funding year 20 was funding year 19 was the last of that. And they're trying to figure out, what are we going to do to solve this? They allowed a 1-year extension and then threw in a little bit of one-time money, which meant for an interesting funding year this year. And then they said, okay, we're going to start some new rules starting in funding year 2021, which actually starts next July, which means we'll be working on it in the next 3 to 6 months, right? So for this new funding cycle that's coming up, we will have $167 per student. And that is pre-discount cost. I've kind of laid that out in the example on the slide here. So, 2,000 student district over 5 years, that district could spend $334,000 in total project cost, category 2. And I just picked the highest discount rate. Districts like Neal's may have a different discount rate, but just know that out of that $334,000 in our example, the district does have an obligation. It may be as little as 15%, and it may be more than that. If you want to spend it all in one whack, it could be for different projects. And that's kind of the total amount there. It is not inflation adjusted. And I know I'm really flying through. There's a lot to this. The other thing I will point out is there is a per site funding floor of $25,000, probably deeper than we can go in the few minutes we have remaining. The main thing that it means is if you have a really small school where $167 a student doesn't even add up to 25,000, and you do the division, it's about 150 kids. But if I had some schools that were that small, and some of you do with like alternative schools and things like that have truly been deemed a school, you might be able to do some different budgeting where for that school, I can count it at a $25,000 minimum. And then for the rest of my district, maybe I do the $167 per student. Give our field staff team some time to get up to speed on that. And Scott and crew, Scott's got a pretty good handle on all that. If you're really trying to figure out exactly what your budget's going to be for next year, it depends partially on how large your district is. If it's more than 10 schools, it's just $167 per student, take everything else out of the equation. If I have less than 10 schools, then I might be able to, or 10 or less, I could do a mix of the per site funding floor along with the $167 per student. And I know that gets really complicated really fast. So I'm going to just stop there. And if we got questions in the few minutes we have remaining, we'll do that, or we'll come back later. Tools to stay on top of ERate. Neal said, have you got anything that you'd ask some people there? I would recommend, I'm going to drop out of the slide deck and actually run through this just super quickly. If you've never done this before, if you go to eratecentral.com, there's a hyphen between E and rate. If I just go to eratecentral.com, the hyphen between E and rate, there's a section here, they move it around at times, called state funding. If I go there and then I choose Kentucky, when I choose that state, I can get some state level statistics. But I've also got over on the left-hand side a field for bill density number. Neal, do you know yours right offhand? I knew I've got it in the slide deck, but I know one of my districts, so I know that's going to be one of mine. I don't remember which one. I type in my 6-digit bill density number. It's Webster County, actually. All right, so, and I could see, if I were curious, since the beginning of the ERate program in 1998, I could see what they requested and what was committed in category 1, what was committed in category 2, how much of that was dispersed to the district, which leads to some utilization percentages and things like that. So that if somebody, if you don't know where to start and you're in a school district, it's kind of nice to see where we are. Like I can just tell you right now, like Webster's example, they were one of those there for years that got no Category 2 funding. They managed to get a lot one year, and then you can tell when the rules changed that really helped them with that 5-year, $150 a student thing. They got funded for a little bit of money in each of the past 5 funding years. And of course, they didn't file for funding year 20. I think that because I can see they only had one requested funding request, and it's been funded. And he has not filed his 486 yet, so I need to talk to him about that. So lots going on there. I kind of picked on. I think I picked on Neil and Rhonda with that. So if I go to my slide deck there, and I just pull those two really quickly, just to see. So like if I pick on Pikeville again, they were not as high poverty a district, so for years and years saw no Category 2 funding come to them. And then around in funding year 15, when the rules changed, you can see, as Neil talked about, you get into hundreds of thousands of dollars for them over that 5-year period, and then using a little more of it here with this last funding year 2020. If I take a Jackson County, higher poverty, look at this. And probably, I don't know if it was Rhonda doing it at the time, but Jackson County has gotten a lot of Category 2 funding over the years until eventually the program got in such a status where they couldn't fund those same people every year. So you do see the zeros there, but totally different dynamic just on Category 2, just comparing those two districts. And so I thought I'd do that to mess with you too, since you were listed on the presenter part of this.
There are various. Not me that got all that money.
Well, it was your district though, so
it was my district, yes, but it was not.
It did benefit the kids there, right? And so yeah, most of you'll get familiar with your 6-digit bill density number if you mess with ERate very much at all. It's a 6-digit number that every district has, because you had to sign up and get it empty when you started the program. The various tools, that links out to just a general tools page off the Usac site. It's changed some over the years. There are a few that I use quite a bit. The search commitments, I can actually pull that one up and see. I can't do anything very quickly, apparently, on my internet. All right, I can see like we've got 6 waves to funding year 20, but if I wanted to, I could drill down and I could drill down to wave 6, and I could go to Kentucky, and I could pull a spreadsheet, and it would show me who got funded in Kentucky in wave 6. That one's a pretty handy one. And I also use the where is it? The FRN status tool. If I pick that and choose the right criteria, which I usually grab every piece of information I can grab, I'd say I would pick Kentucky, and maybe I just care about school districts because that's what my job's related to. And I could say I'll select my data points and just give me all of them. I could click that build data file, and it would build a spreadsheet that's our CSV file that's got detail on every funding request for every school district in the state of Kentucky. Tells you if it's funded or if it's pending, if it's canceled, if it's denied, any other comments, how much money was involved, what vendors, you name it, it's there. And then I would also recommend subscribing to some of these newsletters. The news of the week from ERate Central, that site that I was just on, e-ratecentral.com, and then the weekly SL news brief that comes directly from Usac. So that one's going to be definitely authoritative. Whereas the one from ERate Central, that group is very plugged in. I've not found them to be inaccurate. I hate getting spam emails as much as anybody, but those two are well worth it, in my opinion. I don't consider it spam. So there you go. I took up all the time. I'm terrible. I made Neil leave. How's that? Neil is closing down the other session. So I will thank everybody for attending. And if there are questions, I think we can hang around this chat room for a few minutes. I know there's some stuff that's being sent out or will be soon on how to get the PD stuff and or get the EVA credit. And I am filling time at this point. Ron, is there anything to add? Because I'm getting the reverb from.
I can hear Courtney talking on track.
She's closing down. She's closing down track 2, and I'm sure Neil's helping with that. And we're going to close down this first track here in just a moment. I'm sure this will be archived on the ERATC YouTube site, and hopefully it's worthwhile for folks. It's hard to do an overview on a topic this complex in the 45 minutes that we have, but I hope it's worthwhile, and I hope today's been worthwhile. These folks have done a phenomenal job to try to put something together for everybody. So
yes, it's been a great day. I've learned a lot, and it's been wonderful. But Like you said, it's hard to summarize E-rate in 45 minutes, but at
You
least you get the
can't.
high
I can
points.
barely get started, right? I can barely get started in 45 minutes. So,
Listen, I compared it to doing taxes all year long.
so have your applications been funded?
Not yet. I had PIAs on about everything, and so I turned those in, and I've not heard anything back, and it's been almost 2 weeks, so I'm getting a little concerned.
I can understand. Yeah,
Yep.
Let's see. Yeah, well, they're going to close us down in just. They're going to close us down in just a second, and I was actually going to show super quickly before they close us down. That's an example of one of those spreadsheets that gets pulled down. It's got the FRN number. It's got everything, and I can sort it and do whatever. It's super powerful stuff. Probably a lot more than what most people would need. So, but it's pretty handy nonetheless.
Now, Rhonda, you know where all that information comes from.
Yeah.
Jody, good old Jody. If it wasn't for him, I'd never be able to figure it all out. He's wonderful.
Neil, I don't have the magic touch on the keys, but I've tried to close us down. I've thanked everybody. I don't have the links to send on all the other stuff. I know there's only so many places you can be at once, but
I was really hoping that Rhonda had asked you some really technical E-rate question, and I had texted her. I said, stall Jody and ask him a hard question.
That's awesome.
Oh, I just now got it. I missed it.
There's a reason we got a back channel text, Rhonda.
Oh, wow.
No, I had my phone on silent so it wouldn't interrupt.
I appreciate you all so much today. I will wrap up this session right now. Again, thank you all for joining us today for the 2020 Kentucky K12 Virtual Technical Summit. And we have a survey link, of course.